Hi, everyone. Thank you for making the time to join us today. I'm Joyce Karam, Editor-in-Chief of Al Monitor, and looking forward to our discussion on the US and Israel's war in Iran. One month in, this is very much a regional conflict with global implications. Trump has threatened Europeans again this morning for not helping in opening the Hormuz Strait. Iran continues to hit Gulf countries. Israel has now reoccupied South Lebanon up to the Litani River and is striking Bekaa. The Houthis have entered the war. Russia is reportedly helping Iran, and Pakistan's foreign minister is in China asking Beijing to mediate. In 1 month, we have seen at least 1,400 civilians killed in Iran, 1,200 in Lebanon, 31 across Arab Gulf states, and nearly 20 in Israel. What is next and where do we go from here? I couldn't have wished for a better panel to answer these questions. Randa, Hamid, Hasan, great to have you. They're no strangers for those of you following the Middle East. Randa Slim, program lead for the Middle East program at the Stimson Center and has decades of experience in track 2 dialogue and reporting on the region. Hamidreza Azizi, visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and author of the Iran Analytica newsletter. Hamid, great to have you. I have to say, we've been addicted to your Twitter feed. Every night I check for the latest analysis on what's happening in the war. So, really good to have you here. Hasan Alhasan joining us from Bahrain. He's also someone with extensive experience on Gulf security and Gulf policy. He's a senior fellow for Middle East policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And it's great to have him join us from Manama today. So it's really a pleasure. And how we're going to do this is we only have 1 hour. We're going to go back and forth as much as possible, and we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and have a question, please just put it in the chat, and we'll try our best to get to it. But Hamid, I want to open the discussion with you. This has been going on for 1 month. The regime's response has almost surprised everyone. Is that something that you expected for Iran to respond in that way? And just this morning, Secretary of Defense Hegseth is saying Iran maintains the ability to strike. So, what is your assessment of the regime's response thus far?
First of all, thank you so much, and many thanks to our monitor for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, and also to join Randa and Hassan. It's a pleasure. So whether or not it was expected, I remember just last December in the Doha Forum, there were, I mean, as usual, some private meetings, side meetings, and one of them dealt with this question of Iran-GCC relations, and I clearly remember saying there that the reason that the Gulf was somehow intact during the 12-day war, and also the reason why other fronts of the so-called axis of resistance, Iran's partners and proxies, were not activated, was simply because the Islamic Republic did not feel an existential threat in last June during the
The
12-day
June
war.
war, the 12-day war.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And my assessment back then was that if the regime feels an existential threat, it would go to the extreme. I must say that I wouldn't expect that to be as expansive in the very first stage. There were some elements that would be somehow identifiable already in the discourse. For example, the potential to put the UAE and Bahrain in the first line of attacks for the reasons that we know partly, and we can elaborate further. But going as far as targeting Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, Qatar especially. There were also some reported attacks on Oman. So these were kind of indications, I think, that it was even felt as being more existential than one would probably have imagined. And this kind of extreme sense of existential anxiety, I think, had to do also with the fact that just over a month before the start of the war, we had the mass protests in the country and the most severe crackdown and the massacre of thousands of protesters by the Islamic Republic, which led to the greatest legitimacy deficit, of course, in the history of the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. And then it led to a phenomenon which was discussed already by a lot of people within the strategic community in Tehran, and that was the fear of convergence, the convergence of the threat of internal instability and external threats that would accelerate and somehow guarantee the fall of the regime. So, in a sense, the massacre of January 8 and 9 should be understood within the same framework. It was a kind of preemptive measure by the Islamic Republic to evacuate somehow, to make people evacuate the streets, to somehow pacify domestic scene in the expectations of a war that was already coming. So this is the framework in which we should understand. And so far, what we can see is that it has been successful in sort of in its survival and turning this into some sort of a war of attrition, or in their own framing, a war of endurance, in the sense of increasing the costs, military costs on the United States, economic costs on the global markets, oil markets, and in the region, in order to use this as a means to, as they say, redefine the rules of the region. To what extent it's going to be possible, we can discuss it further, but this is a kind of framework I can present to somehow kickstart the discussion.
Well, for sure. Hassan, Bahrain has been on the receiving end of this, of Iranian attacks from very early on. You've pointed out several times that Gulf states have not participated in this war. This is not their war, but they're bearing the brunt of it. How is the situation from where you are in Bahrain? And how concerned are you? We have a question already from the audience that the Wall Street Journal reporting, if Trump decides to end this war without reopening Hormuz, how concerning is that for not just Bahrain, but the GCC countries?
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. Good to be with you and with my fellow co-panelists. I think the first point that's important to keep in mind for the Gulf states is that the Gulf states have really widely varying, widely diverging levels of exposure to the war. That we are in the same boat in the sense that all of the Gulf states, including those like Oman and Qatar, who have had good relations with Iran, who have tried to actively mediate Iran, have been targeted and have been attacked by Iran. We all sort of share the fact that Iran has primarily and overwhelmingly targeted civilian infrastructure. We've counted the numbers at IISS, and we've seen that the overwhelming majority of hits have been confirmed hits on known targets have been targeted at civilian infrastructure, not even military or dual use, but plainly and squarely civilian infrastructure. So the Gulf states sort of share some level of exposure to the war, but the level of exposure, the impact is widely divergent. We see that by looking at the quantitative sort of dimension of Iranian attacks. So the UAE quite famously has absorbed over 47% of all Iranian attacks, compared with under 1% for Oman and under 5% for Qatar. So these are, from a quantitative perspective, very widely divergent levels of exposure. Qualitatively, the impact has also been uneven. The attack, for example, on Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility is substantial. It's expected to take out nearly 20% of Qatar's annual gas production capacity. Kuwait, for example, has been subjected to multiple attacks on water desalination plants. So the impact as well, the damage being done is different. The economic repercussions are also not being felt to the same level. I mean, on the one hand, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar are unable to export any oil, gas, aluminium, steel, or other sort of industrial output, whereas Saudi Arabia is exporting anywhere near 5 million barrels per day, and it's actually able to use higher oil prices to offset some of the lost revenue. And you're seeing that sentiment reflect even in the stock markets, where the Dubai stock market has probably been the world's worst performing over the past month, whereas the Saudi and Omani stock markets have actually risen since the beginning of the war. So you're also seeing very widely divergent market sentiment. And I think that also reflects in the economic projections that vary quite significantly, where Saudi Arabia and Oman are projected to lose a much smaller portion of their real GDP by comparison to Kuwait or Qatar, for example. Now, obviously, that could change if we see truly catastrophic events, such as, say, a nuclear incident at Bushehr, where the US or Israel sort of recklessly endanger that plant, and then you have a catastrophic event that could change the distribution of risk and impact in potentially unpredictable, or at least partly unpredictable ways. But for the moment, the levels of exposure are different. Now, the question on sort of how do you deal with the Strait of Hormuz, and how can the Gulf states sort of address that? I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that the Gulf states have very different ideas and very different views about what to do next, and about where the US should go and how the US should deal with the Strait of Hormuz contingency. We've heard the UAE and Bahrain be very forward-leaning on the need for the US to escalate further against Iran, to use force to restore shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And they've actually even committed to supporting a US-led coalition. And I think the underlying logic there is that Iran should not be allowed to maintain its massive leverage over regional and global economies by controlling the strait. And on the other hand, you have countries like Oman and Qatar who have been also highly outspoken about the need to achieve a ceasefire sooner than later, given the fact that it's the Gulf states sort of outside of Iran that are absorbing the costs of this war more so than any other party, as I said, apart from Iran. And so you have not only sort of varying levels of impact, but also very different views among the Gulf states as to how to deal with the ongoing situation, split sort of between those who favor further escalation and those who favor a quicker resolution and a de-escalatory path towards a quicker end to this conflict.
I think would point out today there's a report by the Associated Press naming Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait among or the leading GCC countries that would not like to see the US end this war prematurely, in their opinion, before the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. So yeah, point taken on at least Qatar and Oman being more just on the diplomatic, favoring the diplomatic channel at this point. Randa, I want to go to you and just looking at this more broadly, did the Trump administration underestimate, underplan for this? There's been comparisons that even in the 1973, after the 1973 war and the oil embargo, the cost has not been as high on Gulf economies and the global economy. So how do you assess the U.S. Prep for this war?
First, good to be with you, Joyce, and good to be with Hamid and Hasan. Listen, the war plans for Iran have been on the books at the Pentagon for ages, right? They have always had these different scenarios, and they have always trained for them and prepared for them. I think where is the underestimation is in the mindset of the president. I don't think that he was ready for a protracted war, although we are still only 1 month into it. But still, in his eyes, it was going to be the Venezuela model. He will send, the military. They will kill or he will send, the planes, they will kill the leadership as was the case, as has happened in the first 2 days of the war. And then the whole regime will fall. And then he will have his leader to be talking with, or who is willing to talk with the Americans and make a deal with Mr. Trump. That was his mindset. And so I think the fact that Iran has been able to resist until now, that missiles are still raining, on Israel, on Gulf countries. The fact that the regime has proven to be pretty much cohesive. It has not fallen apart. It has been able to activate proxies, Hezbollah's, the Iraqis, PMF, recently the Houthis. Definitely this was not in the cards as far as Trump is concerned, and as well as far as a small circle of decision making around Trump. And so that's why you see that all this criticism about a war that has had no strategy, or a war in search of a strategy, that tactically it has achieved successes for sure. But given the lack of strategy, is going to be, we are seeing the president walking back day after day some of the objectives that he has been setting out for the war. Like the first speech he gave Saturday morning when on February 28th, anybody who listened to that speech say, this is regime change. This is what they are aiming at. And then after that, it is about nuclear power, about production capacities. And then after that, it was about the Strait of Hormuz. And recently, it's no longer about the Strait of Hormuz. So he keeps walking back and these objectives because there is no strategy. And so the objective keeps changing. And so his resolve as well is in question about whether he would like to wage this for a long time. Now, the Secretary of War, Mr. Hexat, this morning said, when asked about the timeline, he went all the way from 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and who knows, the timetable. Mr. Rubio, the Secretary of State, he keeps saying weeks, not months, but weeks could turn into months, when he talks about weeks. And so it's definitely a confusing situation at home. It's a confusing situation for our allies in the Gulf. It's a confusing situation for, the Europeans, of course. And Iran is gaining from this confusion and is gaining from this strategic ambiguity that we find the United States stuck in since the beginning of this war.
And we've also seen, oddly, we've seen sanctions relief.
Correct.
Come to Iran in ways that hadn't happened, not even in the Trump first term. So it's definitely an interesting situation to be looking at. But Hamid, Randa's point that the regime has been resilient is still intact. Is that something that you agree with? We saw Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, talk about fractures within the regime. So if you can just talk a little bit about the regime post the Khamenei, the father, and tell us a little bit. We hear so much about Ghalibaf right now, the Speaker of the Parliament, that this is somebody maybe the U.S. has a back channel with. So is the regime intact, and is Ghalibaf, you see somebody willing to work with the U.S. for an exit strategy?
First of all, yes, I agree with Randa's assessment, and that's what we are seeing. I mean, cohesion at the strategic level. There might be some divergences regarding the end game, regarding the exit strategy, regarding how long the Islamic Republic can or should continue this fight. But these are not the things that have come to surface, in any form. These are not some things that can be identifiable through the state media, through the official statements, and so on. So at least at the surface level, and also operationally, cohesion has been somehow maintained. So that's for sure. Regarding Ghalibaf or any other figure on that matter, I think that has been part of the mistake or misinterpretation, better to say, that Randa also mentioned regarding a Venezuela-style scenario. Because, this kind of search for one single person with whom the United States can make a deal, who can be more pragmatic than others, etc. This kind of tells us about that same, Venezuela-style mindset, right? Because we took out Khamenei, then we took out, as Trump has said a couple of times, I think, the second and third layer of the leadership, and now we are dealing with the fourth layer. So this has to do with a very deep misunderstanding of the nature of the system, which is very much decentralized at the top and also decentralized at the command level. So we've seen both of them at work since the start of this war. Operational decentralization within the framework of the so-called Mosaic Doctrine, which gives operational freedom in identifying and also, kind of firing at the targets. So this authority, it gives this authority to the local and provincial commanders. That was the reason that even unlike the 12-day war, the Islamic Republic could start responding almost 2 or 3 hours after the first wave of American and Israeli strikes. And then at the strategic level, the decentralization has been quite evident in the sense of a division of labor, actually, between different elements, better to say, different state organs. So now the role of the administration, the Pezeshkian administration, has reduced to providing day-to-day needs for the people, to making sure that, the economy is still operating despite the blows and everything. And everything related to war and peace and, strategic decisions on those matters has been handed over to a very small circle of figures with political and military background. Ghalibaf is the face of it. We don't know everybody who's there, but some of them are quite known, of course. Ahmad Vahidi, for example, the acting commander-in-chief of the IRGC. And I'm saying acting because there's no order by the new supreme leader appointing him as the in the job. Then we saw the return of some of the old Revolutionary Guards figure to top leadership levels, top leadership positions, like Mohsen Rezai, for example, the former commander-in-chief of the IRGC. And I've heard some others also being called back. I don't have the concrete information, but this is something that I've seen also mentioned in the media. So in a sense, the system has been kind of able to concentrate around the security core, IRGC related, and now and also expanded to some of the positions that were somehow standing in the middle, like the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. So who was there? It was Larijani. Of course, again, speaking at the personal level, he could be seen as a pragmatist person, able of making consensus between different parts of the Iranian system, and also to make some deal with the United States, probably. But what happened after him? We have Zolghadr, who is a IRGC general from the kind of ultra hardline end of the Iranian spectrum. So my point is that there can be, of course, some divergences, as I said, regarding regarding parts of the war strategy or the exit strategy or something. And I saw, for example, a report by New York Times. I don't know to what extent the details are correct, but what I can say as an analyst working on Iran is that the differences at the system level, what has to do with Pezeshkian administration versus the security core, it doesn't matter. It simply doesn't matter. It didn't matter before. It doesn't matter at all at this moment because of that reduction in the role that I said. So as far as the war continues, I think this cohesion is going to remain. Afterwards, we know that there's different factions even within that so-called conservative hardline camp. They may start competing for power, but because, again, everything has to do with this existential anxiety. So they first need to make sure that the system remains so that they can compete with each other.
So it's not, so what I hear you saying, it's less, it's wrong to be fixated on one figure, whether it's Ghalibaf, whether it's the new head of the national security, and it's more the IRGC, the hardliners, the conservatives, actually consolidating power and post Ali Khamenei, and just how they view this as existential threat and how they steer the road ahead. I'll come back to you more on that, on Israel's calculus for regime change. But Hasan, in light of all of this, in light of a hardening positions in Iran, in light of wins that Iran's may be seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, where do the Gulf countries go from here? We have a question, on the air defense capabilities. We saw Zelensky, tour Gulf states over the weekend. How big of a crisis when it comes to defense, when it comes to dealing with a more hardline regime in Iran is for the Gulf states?
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. So I think that depends on a number of critical parameters that we don't necessarily have answers for. But I think at this stage, in the fog of war, sometimes it's just as important to be asking the right questions and to be on the lookout for the right critical parameters. So I think for the Gulf states, the critical parameters are as follows. To begin with, what further capacity for escalation does Iran have? And that, I think, has to be read at two levels. First, to what extent has Iran been practicing restraint when targeting Gulf states? So if the answer is Iran has been practicing a degree of restraint, then obviously it can practice less restraint and thereby escalate further. And I think there is, despite obviously the very serious and damaging nature of the attacks, including those that have affected national critical infrastructure, it seems as though Iran is practicing some kind of restraint in its targeting patterns, partly perhaps not necessarily out of the generosity of its heart, but partly to be able to retain room for counter-escalation and to be able to respond in kind to US and Israeli attacks against it, and by sort of directing in sort of at a superficial level, an absurd fashion, its retaliation at the Gulf states. And so I think we've seen a degree of a response in kind where, the US strikes a desalination plant in Qashm Island. Iran responds by striking desalination plants in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Fujairah. Israel strikes at an Iranian university. Iran strikes or threatens to strike at US universities in the Gulf states. So in a sense, Iran tries to maintain this in-kind retaliation pattern. But that means that Iran, that implies that Iran is also able to target indiscriminately vital infrastructure in the Gulf. They've clearly shown the ability, the precision, the intel capability to strike vital critical infrastructure, and in a sense they could be sort of more indiscriminate in the way that they do it. The second obviously consideration when it comes to Iran's ability for further escalation is its material capacity to do so. How many drones and how many missiles can it continue to fire? And despite the significant drop in the average rate of Iranian missile and drone attacks against the Gulf states, they've clearly shown an ability to surge in numbers, as we've seen over the past few days. So over the past few days, we've seen a big uptick in the number of drone and missile strikes against Bahrain, against the UAE, against Saudi Arabia. So there is clearly a residual capacity to surge attacks if and when needed. So the risk of further Iranian escalation, I think, is important. Because if Iran can continue to escalate further, then obviously that should inform Gulf preferences as to whether to try and reach a de-escalation now or continue to press the US for a more sort of definitive or a more favorable situation. Now, the other consideration...
How so? Do you mean to say if we see further escalation, would that make it more likely that the Gulf states want to reach a settlement, or is it more so if we see de-escalation, they're more likely to be willing to do so?
So I don't think there is a common sense answer. It could go either way, and we're seeing it go either way to some extent. I mean, with the Qataris and Omanis essentially saying the costs are too large, we should stop because we are absorbing all of these costs. And on the other hand, you're seeing the Emiratis and the Bahrainis sort of show greater defiance. But I think if my view is that if Iran is able to mount much further escalation, that I think that would augur in favor of a quicker resolution and a quicker end to this war, because the amount of damage that Iran could cause further would, to my mind, sort of act as a deterrent against the Gulf states pushing for further US escalation. But that's not the only consideration. Obviously, the Gulf states' ability to defend against Iranian attacks is sort of the other part of this equation. We don't exactly know what the status of their interceptor stockpiles are, but that's not the only element of the defensive equation here. There is a limited European effort, British and French, to blunt Iranian attacks. There are new systems deliveries that are reportedly being shipped out from the Koreans, the Italians, and then there's the question of how quickly the Gulf states can absorb Ukrainian know-how and Ukrainian technology. And the final consideration, I would say, is really about the staying power of the US and Iran. If the Iranian regime is close to collapse, for all we know, then really it might not make sense to try and cut a deal with them now. You might as well wait them out and deal with whatever comes next. Your sort of nightmare scenario is already here, that Iran is already striking you. On the other hand, there's a question about US staying power as well. And so the risk you run by supporting a US coalition, by joining a US coalition, is that Trump sort of backs out halfway through and then leaves you to your own devices in conflict and in confrontation with Iran. So all of these parameters, I think the offensive and the further escalatory capacity of Iran, the defensive equation, the staying power of Iran and the US, I think these are the critical parameters that should help the Gulf states decide how in which direction to go, whether to push for further US escalation and to sort of get the job done, so to speak, and we can get into what that means, or on the other hand, to try and seek a diplomatic off-ramp and a quicker end to this war.
Randa, I want to go to Lebanon just briefly. March 1st, Hezbollah decided to enter the war. Fired, I believe, 6 rockets at Israel. Now we're in a situation where Israel is very much up to the Litani River line and is threatening to just clear out the area. The Defense Minister Katz is saying they want another Rafah or North Gaza in South Lebanon. How bad was Hezbollah's calculation there, or would that have happened anyway?
I think they had no choice. Once the supreme leader was killed, they were ideologically and religiously bound to retaliate. Their first retaliation, 6 rockets. And I think they were hoping maybe this would be the end of it. But after that, I think they were forced to go into the wider war. Look, Hezbollah has been engaging in series of miscalculation, partly because, one, their lack of understanding of how the October 7 war changed the Israeli mindset at the societal level, at the political level, at the military level. And partly, like in this case, they had no choice but to enter the war. And I think that's a problem that Hezbollah will be facing, is that the leadership, especially in the past, that used to be able to keep the party together, keep the forces under their leadership, is no longer there. There are, of course, reports of IRGC taking over, and I think the fact that We have had 6 IRGC figures killed recently, announced so by the Iranian leadership, killed in Lebanon, tells you that they were basically there helping with the operations and helping with the leadership, especially of the military wing. Hezbollah is facing a major stress test going forward. If we look back, I mean, there are 2 factors that have enabled Hezbollah to sustain itself in Lebanon. One is its embeddedness in the Shia community. And right now there are serious rifts inside this community about Hezbollah and about its miscalculation, about its decision, taking the community into further destruction within 18 months, basically. 2 decisions that proved to be catastrophic for the community. But
is this new?
I think this has started right after it has been going on for some time after the end of the last war, when Hezbollah was not able to help with reconstruction. So the joke in the Shia community was that Hezbollah went around, did estimates, of the destruction, and then gave people what we call promissory notes, right? And people were joking even before the beginning of this war, we are going to frame this promissory note because they will never pay us. And so the aura, the prestige of Hezbollah, fulfilling its promises of reconstruction was deeply punctured even before this war. And so you have now serious rifts inside this community. You will always have the 30% of Shia, maybe 40%, which is core constituency. These are the families where the fighters come from. These are the families that rely on Hezbollah for basically salaries and survival. These are the ideological core. But then the rest of the Shia, you have a large group, basically the majority, where there is now debates about what Hezbollah has done. Now, the second factor that has ensured durability of Hezbollah in the past was almost the political cover which successive Lebanese governments gave to Hezbollah's military wing and its status as a non-state armed actors within the state. And that has been now withdrawn. That political cover has been withdrawn. Lebanon has submitted recently a note to the UN saying that Hezbollah is now, the military wing of Hezbollah is an outlaw organization. So I think with these 2 factors in mind, the fissures inside the Shia community, the political cover withdrawn, I mean, the erosion of Hezbollah's stature and legitimacy within the Lebanese society, within the Lebanese polity, I think over time, this is going to keep Hezbollah weak and weaken it even further, and will present Hezbollah with serious stress tests However, listen, what's happening in Lebanon have to be contextualized against at least what's happening in Iran, between the Iran and the US. So there is the invasion, of course, of South Lebanon that you refer to. And then there is a debate inside Lebanon about Hezbollah's weapon and the disarmament and all of this. And all these 3 crises, if we can put it this way, are interconnected. And so, and whatever happens in one, at least on the Iran-US front, is going to affect very much what happens in the other 2. Although until now, the war, Israel has been waging its war in Lebanon totally independently of the US, and the US also administration has not shown any interest in reining in Israel or in pushing for mediation or stopping of the war. And so
even
diplomatically, yeah, go ahead.
Even if the war with Iran ends, there is no guarantee that the occupation of South Lebanon would be over or the Hezbollah-Israel confrontation would.
No, there is no guarantee, because if you listen to today's, as you refer to, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Mr. Katz, I mean, what did he talk about? He talked about a security zone that is about 30 kilometers deep in Lebanese territory. He's talking about an occupation, a permanent occupation, and he's talking about the Gaza model being important and applied to Lebanon, with the destruction of all the villages and all the houses on the border between Lebanon and Israel. So it doesn't look like, operationally, Israel is interested in a short-term wrapping up of this war. In fact, politically, it's there to stay. And so we are back to what happens after the agreement in 2024, where you had Israel occupying 5 strategic outposts, Israel hitting Hezbollah at will, and Israel basically relying on a weak government. Right now, you have that kind of status quo basically on steroid. So instead of 5 strategic outposts, you have this whole stretch of the country. You have 600,000 people displaced. But Israel would like to continue with this going forward. That occupation plus hitting Hezbollah at will, plus relying on a Lebanese government that's not going to make the tough, right decision. I mean, the tough decision to go after Hezbollah.
No, and I would just add, this is the first Israel-Hezbollah or Israel-Lebanon war where you don't have an Assad in Syria.
Yes.
So it's more problematic for Hezbollah, with the Syrian government also announcing yesterday they've blocked 2 tunnels. So we'll come back to that, the Syria calculus of this. But I do want to go to Hamid. Hamid, there is some leaks coming from Israel, some reporting saying that they would like to push the Trump administration to hit more infrastructure in Iran, to hurt the regime economically. Because if you do that, if you even hit the Kharg island harder, maybe, just maybe, the regime may be more strained and would fall. You would see more unrest inside Iran. Is that something plausible in your opinion?
It's not about regime change. It's about the state collapse. That's how I can see it. And these 2 options were on the table from day one, I think. And Israel, especially Israel, was pursuing somehow both at the same time because the war started. I mean, the very first day of the war, if we look at the pattern of strikes, it started, of course, by decapitation attacks on the supreme leader and other senior officials. But then it continued by targeting the how is it called? Internal security institutions. Those police headquarters, intelligence ministry, major IRGC. So it wasn't just about military capacity. It wasn't just about degrading Iran's, missile, drone, whatever, even industrial military capacity to the extent that it's not going to be a threat for Israel. It's about something bigger. It's about causing a destruction as massive as possible so that the Iranian government, with or without a regime change, would need decades to reestablish its capacity and to become a threat, for example, for Israel once again. So that's the way I can see it, and I think because of the fact that we spoke before, the fact that the Islamic Republic is still there, of course, in a weakened position materially, which means that the regime change scenario didn't happen because the regime change, the assumption of regime change was always based on the calculation that a foreign invasion, foreign attacks would lead to the people to come to the streets and occupy governmental buildings and initiate the regime change. So without that element, it's not possible. And that's exactly what, as I said, that's exactly why the Islamic Republic committed that massive massacre. It wasn't just about, if the aim was just to suppress the protest, they couldn't do it maybe in a different way. They wanted to spread fear to the extent that they would make sure when the war happens, people are not going to go to the streets. And this is something that's happening at the moment. Based on the very limited information that's coming out, there's a sense of frustration. It's not that there has been a massive rally around the flag effect as a result of the war. Of course, the longer it takes, the more infrastructure of the country targeted, more and more people are getting disillusioned with Trump's plans. But it doesn't necessarily and automatically translate into support for the Islamic Republic. But the fear and the wounds are just that's the way I can frame it. The wounds are just are still open. We are speaking of thousands. The minimum estimate is 7,000, more than 7,000 people. So that's the reason. Because that didn't happen, And because I think there is this concern among the Israelis that President Trump may decide to end this war at any moment, they have somehow accelerated the process of targeting the infrastructure. So attacks on oil refineries, attacks on energy infrastructure, attacks on the industrial universities. So everything is just aimed at paralyzing the capacity of the country. And then we shouldn't forget that there's, I mean, as much as there's an asymmetry in the military capabilities, there's also a huge asymmetry in the prospects for reconstruction, because Israel does have the money, Israel does have the allies willing to invest for whatever destructed as a result of Iranian attacks, retaliatory attacks, but Iran simply doesn't have that luxury. And the only option for Iran would be to go all in its partnership with China, but China, as we know, has its own restraints, and unless there is a regional settlement, including Iran and Gulf countries, and also a longer-term prospect of stability that would guarantee that Chinese investment would be more or less safe. That's not going to happen, and that's one of the reasons that among the conditions that the Iranian leadership are insisting on for ending this war is a lifting of the sanctions. Because look, their argument is that we were engaged in these negotiations for like 20 years, something. It didn't lead to any sanctions removal. Now, within the war, we are selling our oil. We are selling it with fewer discount at higher prices. We got sanctions lifting on our oil stranded at sea, and we are getting tolls from the ships going around the Strait of Hormuz. So economically speaking, they are actually in a better situation than they were before the start of this war. So the minimum they want to have is to somehow formalize this kind of situation. And just one word to confirm from the Iranian perspective what Randa was saying about the restructuring of Hezbollah. That's also my understanding, looking at the Iranian sources about the post-12-day war attempts by the IRGC to, and before that, the post-2024 war, Lebanon war, by the Quds force to restructure, not just to revive, but to restructure Hezbollah. So it was mostly at kind of reorganizing the operational model around the original Hezbollah kind of infrastructure, less centralized, kind of more agile force, capable of kind of doing guerrilla operations and so on. But at the same time, this investment that they have had on Hezbollah and other groups, now they are insisting that end of the war can only mean when there's an end on all fronts, including Lebanon. And my reading is that they are serious in that, because already before the start of the war, there was a camp within the security establishment arguing that if a war happens, I mean, before Iran's own war, if there's a new Israeli war against Lebanon, against Hezbollah, Iran should involve in support of Hezbollah, because this time it's not just about inflicting tactical changes; it's about changing the face of the region, and this is not something that they could accept. So this is the reading from Tehran.
Can I add something to this? Can I add
very
something
quickly,
to this
Randa?
point?
I want to go to Hasan now. I have a lot of questions from the audience too. Go ahead.
So I was in Beirut when the rockets were launched, and so I had some conversation with people who are close, not too close, but close to Hezbollah. And what I was told is that assurance by Iran to Hezbollah of basically sticking by Hezbollah when the time comes was given early on to Hezbollah by the Iranians.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I don't know, sticking by Hezbollah these days means different thing than sticking by Lebanon. I mean, we see
Yeah, yeah, of
what's
course,
happening with
yeah.
the displaced across the country. But Hassan, if I want to go to you, we have 24 questions. At least 5 are on Gulf security and. Also, the relationships with Egypt. There seemed to be some disappointment, at least on the the Emirati level, of Egypt's position that it didn't come as supportive of Gulf states, Arab League generally. What's your reading of that? Uh, there is also you've talked a little bit about it, that the UAE and Bahrain would join a coalition to reopen Hormuz. Would that mean they would join the larger war? Um, and we saw the Iranian foreign minister yesterday, I believe, saying, well, Saudi Arabia, you're brotherly nation to us, but if you didn't have this base, we wouldn't be hitting you. Maybe it's time to move U.S. bases. Sitting in Bahrain, home to the Fifth Fleet. What do you make of that argument? So, very easy, 3 questions for you. Over. Yeah.
Thanks, Joyce. I'll do my best. So I think, I'll start with the last point because I think that's the easiest one to answer. I don't think we should take that Iranian talking point too seriously. I think it's a pretext. It's a sort of strategic talking point that's used to justify Iran's attacks on the Gulf states. If you look at the pattern of Iranian targeting, we've done the math at IISS. Most of the Iranian hits that have been confirmed against known targets have affected civilian targets, not military targets, not dual-use targets. What does having U.S. military bases, what does that do with universities, with oil refineries, with power plants, with water desalination plants, and so on and so forth? So I think, this is part of the Iranian strategic narrative. It's part of the information warfare. I don't think it's borne out by the pattern of Iranian targeting in the region. I think the real underlying strategy here is that Iran sees the Gulf states as the soft underbelly of the global economy. It sees the Gulf states as the soft underbelly of the global energy security, and therefore attacking them allows Iran to escalate horizontally and to inflict asymmetric pain on the US and the rest of the global economy. So, sort of my hypothesis would be actually that Iran would probably have attacked the Gulf states even if they had no military bases of the US whatsoever. And I think that's also borne out by the fact that Iran attacked Oman, which doesn't
Twice.
have a multiple times actually, and there's probably a degree of underreporting by the Omanis on the attacks that they have been subjected to from Iran, so as to not sort of cause embarrassment and lose face. But I think that sort of talking point is the easiest one to dismiss. The question about joining the war, I think, is a really interesting one. And it's one that has been debated at length in Gulf policy circles. The important point to note here is that the Gulf states do have offensive capabilities that they would be able to field even from a standoff range at Iran should they choose to do so. And I've written a piece about the Gulf states' offensive options and the associated risks. The key point to note here, and of course, I mean, they have large and modern air forces, large amounts of land attack cruise missiles that they can fire at significant range. Their UAV acquisitions have been very significant, and we've recently put something out on their UAV defense acquisitions, including some one-way attack capability and so on. So the offensive capability to strike at Iran to retaliate against Iranian aggression exists. But the Gulf states have made a choice to exercise restraint and sort of strategic patience. Partly, I think, because the Gulf states are not united in the perceived need and the expediency of responding to Iran with force. Partly because I think there is distrust in U.S. staying power, and no one wants sort of to be left alone in this conflict. And then the question of whether that would have a material impact on Iran's calculations, I think, is also an important one. But there is a case to be made, I think, that at the moment, it's really, I think this is a divisive issue within the Gulf. Now, I think there is a wider point to be made here, and this goes back to your question about Egypt, but not just Egypt. I mean, Pakistan as well. Pakistan has signed a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. And despite very strong Pakistani messages of support, we haven't seen any overt military assistance from either Egypt, Pakistan, or some of the other long-standing recipients of Gulf bailout assistance. And I've personally documented hundreds of billions of dollars in Gulf bailout assistance, of which Egypt and Pakistan, in addition to Iraq of the 1980s, were the largest historical recipients. So there is, I think, a lot of disappointment with the Egyptian role. But I think there is a wider point to be made here, is that in reality, sort of Gulf economic statecraft has in a sense, largely backfired. The checkbook diplomacy hasn't really paid off. The Gulf states haven't been able to sway President Trump on this war in their direction. Israel clearly, I think, has had a bigger influence. And the checkbook diplomacy with Egypt and Pakistan, in this instance at least, I mean, there have been obviously previous cases of Pakistani and Egyptian military assistance to the Gulf. We can't deny that. But in this specific case, I think that hasn't been forthcoming. And then, ultimately, the Gulf states had relied on their indispensability to the global economy as a source of protection, that they were too big to fail. And that if they were to fail, then that would have wide-ranging repercussions for the global economy. The issue is that Iran has now weaponized this, in a sense, against the Gulf states and against the global economy. It sort of painted a big red target on the Gulf states' backs and has sort of put them at the center of Iran's asymmetric strategy of horizontal escalation. So in a sense, it has, at least in wartime, it has backfired vis-a-vis Iran, even though obviously its peacetime dividends have been very significant.
Very insightful and interesting. We only have 3 minutes left, and we can go for another 2 hours, but I know Randa, you have another panel in another hour. But Hamid, I want to go to you. There's a question about the Kurds in Iran. When this started, we, among others, reported that, a plan to get the Kurds to foment internal revolt and perhaps, push militarily in their areas, inspiring other minorities to rise up. That has not happened. Why, in your opinion, it hasn't? And is it something that could happen later?
I'll try to keep it short. Of course, there have been some reports about why this hasn't worked. So if I want to summarize those arguments that seem plausible to me, and I also could confirm from my sources, what I check daily. So one is, of course, the pressure by Turkey on the United States, especially when it becomes clear that this is actually, on the table as an option. So Turkey obviously doesn't want this to happen due to the potential repercussions for itself. Then it has to do with the Kurds' own hesitation and considerations, especially because it wasn't just too long ago when the United States abandoned the Kurds in Syria. So that was a recurring theme. I heard from my Kurdish friends who are much better experts on this topic than I am, that this is a serious concern. That's to what extent and for how long they can rely on the support of the United States if they want to enter into the country. And the third element was that since day one, Iran started and still continues to target whatever position, even slightly affiliated with the Kurdish insurgent groups in Iraqi Kurdistan, because the understanding in Tehran is that even if, for the moment, this has been removed from the table, I mean, the Kurdish part, but in the day after the war, and especially if as we can see now, the Islamic Republic is in a weaker position, then it can come as a complementary element, to further through asymmetric means, through indirect means to weaken the regime and initiate a regime collapse or whatever. So they continue doing it. So it's a combination of these three factors, as far as I understand.
Thank you, Randa. Hasan, I'm gonna throw last two questions to you, Randa. You've done plenty of track two negotiations. Where do you see the Chinese role now, with the Pakistani foreign minister in Beijing, 5-point plan, very generic. Do you see China emerging, as a potential guarantor or mediator in this conflict? And Hasan, immediately after to you, what would be an acceptable outcome for most GCC states? So, Randa.
Quickly, I think there is a conflict resolution framework that's being put in place. So on one hand, you have the mediators or the facilitators, the four countries led by Pakistan. And then neither of these countries can play the guarantor role for the United States. And so I think China can play this guarantor role. Russia will have a role when it comes to the kilograms of highly enriched uranium. But in terms of guarantor, and then it's going to depend on whether China wants to play this role of a guarantor. It will have risks, but it will have also benefits for China.
Hasan?
I think the answer varies depending on who you ask in the Gulf. The Emiratis have been explicit about the need to find a comprehensive sort of resolution, an outcome that addresses Iran's sort of the full spectrum of Iran's power projection capabilities. So that's a very maximalist sort of outcome here, and I think that probably reflects the disproportionate Iranian targeting of the UAE, and that has probably pushed them in a harder direction. And what that means for them is they see, I think, the need not only to comprehensively address Iran's full spectrum of capabilities, but also to re-entrench and deepen relations with Israel and really to establish a credible deterrence against Iran. And we've heard this from Dr. Anwar Gargash, who essentially predicted that Israel will play a larger role at the end of this conflict. On the other end, you have those, I think, that are perfectly happy with appeasing Iran. Oman is obviously at the forefront of this. To some extent, Qatar might also be willing to play a degree of appeasement with Iran, to recognize that Iran is able to hold a collective Gulf security at risk, that it's able to leverage its geography against the Strait of Hormuz, and so sort of go back to a status quo ante, where there was a de-escalatory dynamic with Iran, trying to get assurances that conflict would not restart. And then there's the more ambivalent, I think, Saudi and Kuwaiti position, irrespective of what sort of Western press has to speculate and say about their views. But the short answer is it really depends on who you ask or on whom you ask in the Gulf.
For the whole panel, just in 30 seconds, how long do you anticipate this will go? Hamid?
I mean, it's really difficult to predict once Trump is, in charge of making the decision. But I think maybe at the minimum it can take another couple of weeks. But at any moment, as we are seeing now, some signs of it, Trump may just declare victory and just leave.
Randa, Hasan, you agree?
I think the challenge is going to be how to find a diplomatic solution that can enable each side to claim a win without being able to deliver a final knockout to the other side.
Hasan?
I think irrespective of how quickly this war ends, it's definitely going to have a very long tail and a very long shadow of instability that it will cast on the region for, I think, the foreseeable future.
Thank you all. This has been an excellent panel. Thank you for your time. I hope next time we meet, it'll be just at least more refreshing, more positive news. Great to see some of you. And thanks to the audience for your questions and for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.